Hey, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Blind Ambition with Jack Kelly. It's Rick from Blind, and today we have a special guest for y'all. We have Cosmin Nicolaescu, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Brex. Before joining Brex, Cosmin led Stripe's global engineering and product teams, helping to scale the company from 100 to over 1,400 employees worldwide. Notably, he led the expansion of engineering teams to places like Seattle, Dublin, and Singapore. And for those of you that don't know, Brex is a financial stack designed to serve the next generation of growing businesses. It's best known for providing companies with credit lines and software to manage their finances. Thanks for coming on the show, Cosmin.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me on. I'm really excited to be here.
So I don't know if you're familiar with Blind, but everyone on Blind is just really fascinated with kind of like leveling up their careers. And that's kind of to put it lightly. Would you be able to walk us through your career? Like, how did you develop your interest in payments? You know, you were at Microsoft, and then you seem to got into like kind of the fintech world with Stripe and Brex.
Yeah. Before I go into that, it's funny that you mentioned blind user in Microsoft, because I remember back in the day when I first joined Microsoft, I joined in 2008. And right at the end of that year, or right in January of 2009, Microsoft had its first set of layoffs. And at the time, there was this website, I don't exactly remember, it was like Microsoft Insider or something like that, which is basically like a senior employee from Microsoft who basically leaked that layoffs are coming. And for like a set of a few months, that's where basically like a ton of activity was there. Everybody was browsing, refreshing, commenting. So it's basically like a pre-blind experience from what I've seen now in
Right.
the last few years. Now every company kind of gets that to blind. Um, so I started my career. I joined Microsoft. I was an intern there during college. And then I joined full time. I was actually in Vancouver my first year because of the migration related things. So I got the experience what it is to be remote. And then I was in Redmond for 4 years. And my first few years there, we're working on like Office 365 and Windows Azure. So not really payments related in any kind of way. It was really my last, I think, 18 months that Microsoft used to have different payments teams for different products. So for example, Windows had its own payments team, and Office had its own payments team, and Azure had its own payments team, and Xbox had its own payments team, and so on and so forth. And that worked fine until they realized that they wanted to cross-sell. So at the time, one of the big issues was that Office 365 was doing really well. It was the fastest growing product to $1 billion. I think it made it in like 6 months, faster than SharePoint previously, which took a year. While Windows Azure was just getting off the ground, I don't think it was having necessarily the traction they were looking for at the time. And one thing that they wanted was to cross-sell, to say like, oh, if you're like an Azure customer, you get some benefit for Office 365 to kind of like drive adoption. What they realized is that they don't have a unified system to be able to do that. Like I couldn't identify a customer for having both Office 365 and Windows Azure to be able to give them a benefit. On top of that, they started having a lot of different issues where customers would have to sign up for different accounts. So like you bought your Xbox, you sign up for an account for Microsoft Payments. And then you got your Windows and you do the same with the app stores and everything. So the experience for users was pretty bad. And so they unified all the teams into a single platform for payments. And I joined that team. I was part of one of the founding members. And basically kind of like unifying the entire stack. And what I really liked, there were two things. One, initially, for the first year, about 40% of the team was in Shanghai. So I got to travel a lot to Shanghai and got to kind of learn about the remote culture and what works and what doesn't, especially as I kind of learned through that when I was doing remote stuff at Stripe and now at Brex with Global. The second thing was that I got to learn about like how actually money moves in the world. Like I didn't really have a clue before. Like obviously I knew cash and I knew the concept of credit card and notes, but it was so superficial. And that allowed me to go a little bit deeper on that. And I really, really enjoyed it. When I decided to leave Microsoft, Stripe was one of the companies that was kind of like up and coming. It was under 100 people when I first learned about it, and I felt that it kind of gives me the opportunity to kind of go deeper on something that I felt it was pretty interesting. Like I really like details, and I really like to think about like systems and how they've been built. And so one of the things that that I loved in both Stripe and Brex is I literally read payment network specs. Like I read the specs of like how they've thought about it, because a lot of them, the industry gets criticized for the fact that it was designed like 20 years ago. It's using FTP and files and everything like that. But number one, files are very efficient to move a lot of information around and reliable and everything. And two, it's very interesting to see how they've actually thought about growth and extensibility through their formats. And so I would read the specs to kind of both understand how it works, but also like what their view at the time was of how the world will evolve. And so that's kind of just like something that I personally enjoyed. And so when I was in Microsoft, that's how I started looking at like other payments companies as one of the potential ways to kind of go in my career. Did that with Stripe. Loved it. It was great. Learned a ton. Spent time kind of like learning about payment methods outside the US as well and around the world. And then I had said that I actually don't want to be in payments after Stripe, because I was like, well, I've done payments. Like, I don't want to be the VP of payments at some random company. I wouldn't go build payments again. But the thing that was really interesting with Brex was that it was a very different side of payments. So when I was thinking about that, I was like, well, yeah, I built payments Stripe. I wouldn't go to like whatever tech company to kind of build their payments team. Like I think they should just do Stripe and be done with it. At the same time, I kind of never spent time on the issuing side of payments. It was always on the acquiring side of payments. And so with the issuing side, like there's a bunch of other challenges that I found really fascinating. And so when I first met Pedro and Enrique, we talked through those and kind of like the path of what it looks like from a like more of a bank perspective, rather than a merchant perspective. And that was really, really interesting. And so ended up joining Brex and kind of continuing going down the payments path in kind of a different way, but obviously a lot of corollary.
And the two gentlemen are the founders of Brex that you referred to,
Correct.
right?
Yeah, Pedro and Enrique are the founders of Brex. They founded Brex when they were in their mid-20s. Similar
And then when you say on the other side, because now you offer credit cards, is that what you mean? And
correct, right. So before
tools.
it was the target audience was at Stripe a merchant that wants to collect payments from customers. Here, I'm basically it's still a B2B business, so I'm supporting other companies, but their primary use case is corporate cards and financial services in general. How do we think about spending across the company? How do we help them scale that spend? How do we take that globally? And so it's a very different angle versus like, how do you actually collect money from your customers?
Just out of curiosity, why did they decide to go in the startup route? Because if I understand it correctly, the roots were, hey, let's give a credit card to startups and smaller kind of entities. Was that just an underserved group and they saw the opportunity there to just kind of own that sector?
Yeah, I think it's primarily best probability to product market fit. So one thing to keep in mind is people do their best work when there's something they can relate to and they have some other experience that kind of contributes to that. Both of them were founders. They knew a ton of founders. They had founded a previous company. They were part of YC at the time. And so they got to actually see the pains that startup founders were having, which at the time was, hey, we have these founders, many of them are international. They basically moved to the US and form a company, whether they're in college, they drop out of college. It's not like necessarily they have a credit history here. Many of them have raised a ton of capital. And despite that, at the time, the pain that was there was, it was really hard to get a corporate credit card. Because what happened at the time before Brex kind of changed this, and now it's become norm, which I think is really impressive for a 5-6-year-old company, was that you were a founder, you wanted to, let's say you raised money, you wanted to open, to get a credit card for your company. Very normal, people spend, you don't want to put your personal credit card or have employees put on their personal card, so you get a corporate card. Great. You'd go to whatever bank, and you would say, I would like a corporate credit card. And what they would do is say, great, you as the founder will run a credit check on you. Sure, you can give us all the details on the company, but we won't really care. So if you as a founder were to get, let's say, a $50,000 a month credit card, that's what you would get for the company. So the company can just use it, but you are the one that's really being underwritten, and you're personally liable, which is a really big deal, because if things go bad, now you kind of have that boundary between like the work and the personal life, which isn't necessarily fair. And so that was how the industry worked. You would go, you would apply, you're personal liable, and your limit was set by what you would be underwritten as a founder. Obviously, as an international founder without credit history, you're not going to have a good credit score if you're not going to get a credit limit, if any. And even if you've raised millions of dollars, you would get these like really small limits that don't really make sense. You're like, okay, I have like $1 million in my bank account, and you're telling me I can spend $10,000 a month. Like, that doesn't really add up. So I think they looked at it as an opportunity to kind of build a product for an industry that really, and a segment that really needed it, and kind of validate the hypothesis. From there, we took it and we actually built a credit card for e-commerce, which kind of had different characteristics. And then we started expanding to other industries. What we realized as we started going and expanding to like any small business, regardless of industry, is that it becomes really hard to differentiate a product. It becomes really hard to figure out how to underwrite. Because with founders, we said, we know how to underwrite startup companies. We know how to underwrite e-commerce companies. We know how to underwrite certain types of companies in a differentiated way. But once you get to every company, it doesn't really matter the size, doesn't really matter the industry, you're starting to have to fall back onto lowest common denominators. So things like a personal credit score. If you're a small business of 5 people, what should, like, I can underwrite you based on some of the sales, but if you don't have a ton of sales because you're just getting started, maybe you've raised some money from like friends or family or whatever, like the founder credit score is probably one of the best signals that you get. And now you're no longer differentiated, because whatever card Brex can offer, any bank can offer the same thing, unless we say we're going to give you a higher credit with a lower score. And obviously, statistically over time, that doesn't really work out well. And so that's part of the reason why we basically went and started focusing more on tech companies and larger companies where we have a differentiated experience and we can help them scale their spend, versus how do we provide the same experience for startup founders to any like small business, which inherently just doesn't really apply because of the way you can think about obtaining credit.
That is so wild how, like, it never would have occurred to me that, you know, a company that could raise an enormous amount of money still would be denied access because, like, hey, we don't know your history. And it had to be really frustrating for a lot of these startups.
It was super frustrating. I mean, that's why, like, Pedro and Enrique, the Brex founders, went into IC with a complete different idea. They went into IC with a company called Beyond, which was supposed to do like augmented reality, virtual reality stuff. And throughout their YC batch, when they looked at the other founders and they kind of learned what founders in the US are struggling with, they just saw this opportunity. And then given their payments experience, they basically built a company in Brazil that was kind of like the Stripe of Brazil. So they had some payments experience. They kind of quickly pivoted towards that because they're like, this is a massive opportunity. They were missing out in an underserved market because no one's really thinking about how do you change the status quo. Everybody was thinking about like, how do I just give you a better website or a better dashboard for managing your credit card, or a shinier credit card, or better rewards? But they weren't really addressing the root cause, which was how do I give credit to a company that has substantial funding and we can get actually real-time insights, which was the other thing, right? Part of the reason why banks wouldn't do that is because they didn't have the technology to be able to provide the same underwriting. If you want, same actually as an individual, if you go and apply for a credit card, they do a one-time review and then they give you a credit limit, and then maybe it gets updated every 1 or 2 years based on your income. You just self-provide. There's no real-time data to see like, okay, how are you doing? Have you raised more funds? How much are you spending? Brex had a real-time feed by connecting to your bank account. And so we could always say, this is how much money they have in the bank account. This is how much money they're burning. We can actually model all that, and we can give you much higher credit limits with much lower losses. Like we had what by industry standards would be considered very aggressive credit limits. And yet our losses were significantly lower than any bank out there because we basically model things real time. And so the losses were much more calculated. And keep in mind, especially when it comes to the corporate world, everybody, like 99.99% of founders and companies just want to survive and want to grow. They're not out there to kind of scam you. It's a little bit different on the consumer side where maybe you get people that I'm going to sign up for as many credit cards and use one to pay the other and then just play a shuffling game. Companies don't really do that. They just basically want a credit card to spend and they just don't want to have to worry about it, especially startups that are getting off the ground. And so you didn't have necessarily the angle of like someone's trying to defraud Brex. Most of the times when companies wouldn't be able to pay is basically when something really bad happened and all of a sudden they had to, they kind of lost their money. But that's very rare. Typically it's much more easily predictable because companies tend to spend in pattern. And so your spend might go up as you hire more people or you get more services. You might have different like conferences that kind of spike it up, but it's not substantial. So for the most part, it's actually pretty predictable to see and model that.
Now, I'm really interested. I think you mentioned Pedro and Enrique, the founders of Brex, and they famously matriculated to Stanford, dropped out after, I believe, a year to go to Y Combinator. I mean,
Yes.
looking back, you obviously completed university.
I did.
Looking back, would you like do the same thing? Would you have thought like, oh man, maybe I should have just like went straight up into started coding, or are you pretty proud of that kind of career line there for you?
I mean, I think things ended up okay for me, so I don't really have regrets there. But I would say, I don't think this is where like you can kind of see the difference between these exceptional founders and kind of like common people like myself. One, it never even occurred to me to not finish school. Part of that is just like growing up, like education was really important for my parents. I wasn't allowed to play like a ton of sports or do a ton. It was like I did skiing, which was like during the winter time, and even that was limited. I wish I would have done more because it was very much about like you're going to go to school, get good grades, which happened once I got into college, but less so before that. Get a good job, have a career. Like that was just how like the idea of like I'm gonna drop out. Like I couldn't. Not only would that conversation not go well with my parents. Like it would be mind blowing, but it literally never even crossed my mind. Like that was my path. It was like, I'm going to go to the US. I'm gonna work my ass off to get into university and get a scholarship because otherwise I can't afford it. I'm gonna do well because I'm at least studying something that I enjoy. In Romania, it's a little bit different where you have like 15, 16 subjects every year. And so you basically always study everything. And so there's like things that I liked and things that I didn't really like. But in college, for the most part, you get to study the things you like, modulo a few different classes that you have to get electives for. But even then, you have enough choices. And then I'm going to go into an industry that I really enjoy. I love coding. I love solving technical problems. I was like, that's what I want to do. And so that was my path of I'm going to come study, then get a good job, then get a green card in the US. That was my path. There was I didn't contemplate anything else. Do I think that I would do something different now? Probably not, because I still think especially as an immigrant, I don't think I would do that. It's really hard if you're not born in the US or have a US citizenship to be able to stay in the country without going to university and getting a job, et cetera, et cetera. And so I don't think I would do anything differently right now. And if I have friends across the world who would want to come to the US or get a job in the US, I would say do the same thing. If I were born here, would I go to college? I think that's more debatable. I would say the main value that college brought me, other than like really fun memories, was forcing me to learn how to study. Basically, it wasn't until college that I learned like, do I study better under pressure or do I study better by studying sooner? I'm better under pressure, for example. How should I start? I'm more visual. I learned that over time. What are the things that I really enjoy? I got a wide variety of classes. I was like, I enjoy these more, not these more. What kind of teachers? How do I learn? That was even with computer science classes. It didn't matter. Like we learned different programming languages, learned different concepts, but it was really the theory of like, okay, a programming language has these concepts. Everything else I can learn. Like I can learn a new language in like a week or two. That's not hard. And every engineer at Brex, it's not like we use Elixir, we use Kotlin. Most of them have never used those before. But you have the theory and the fundamentals that allow you to kind of grow from that. And I think from that perspective, university is really good at helping you kind of build that mindset. I think otherwise, in terms of content, you can get that content anywhere. There's free classes from MIT and Harvard and the best universities. You can study them on your own. You can read whatever books, you can meet people, and so on and so forth. I think the other part of the college is the network, especially if you go to like an Ivy League school, you end up having a really good network over time. And I noticed my friends who've gone to Ivy League schools that like they have that over the years and it's actually pretty helpful. And so kind of that community support and network, I think is the other part that's useful. But do I think that like you have to have a college degree to be able to get a job as a software engineer? Absolutely no. There's people who start coding now literally since they're like young kids, and the college experience is not going to make a better software engineer in any way. So I think for different industries, it matters. My parents, for example, still want me to get a master's degree. I don't have one. In Romania, everybody gets a master's degree nowadays. And I was like, it doesn't help me with anything. Like I've read the books. I don't. And it's like, yeah, but you want to have it so you get a better job. Like I don't. It literally helps me with nothing. And so.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned kind of like the network aspect of going to college, right? Because I think that's when you find people that are kind of like similarly interested in you or just as motivated, if not more. And I think highlighting that is quite an interesting realization for me, because I think when I went to university, it took me a while to realize that, right? Like I went to Cal Berkeley, and at the time I was like, I'm from San Francisco. Berkeley's a great school. I wanted to stay local.
Yep.
Easy
Great
decision,
campus. I love the
right?
campus.
And now looking back, I'm like, oh gosh, like some of the people that I'm like really closest with, or some of the people that have like got me those like first, second jobs, I could trace back to university. And I just think, oh wow, I never put the two and two together, right? And I think there's often this kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but there's this kind of perception that like education is commoditized, right? Just go for wherever's cheapest, like math is math, or like English is English. You're going to get the same education. But I think people are really misunderestimating that kind of like second order effects.
I think that's probably what these days justified, unless you go into research. Like I think if I think about people who want to go down that path, then the university go to matters, especially on the professor and what they're studying in their labs. I think the most important aspects in choosing that for folks who are considering it right now is mostly like what you're studying and why you're studying that. So for me, it was very obvious. I wanted to get into computers and like computer science. I was into computers before, but like that's what my job was. That's what I wanted to get as a job. And so my major was pretty easily said. Like I knew I went into computer science before. And number two, I felt that it really helps me in actually getting a job that ends up being net positive. So it both helps me with getting a job in the US because of immigration. It both helps me with getting a job because most companies at the time, and even now, still kind of have a minimum requirement that you have to have a bachelor's degree in computer science if you want to get software engineering, just from a filtering perspective. And those were the things for me where it's like, this is totally worth it. And I will go to university. I had no interest in research. And so that wasn't important for me. And I would say nowadays, the mistakes that most people make is either they go to really expensive schools without knowing why they're going to really expensive schools, and they're not really making the most out of that. From example, the community aspect, the networking, things that last for a longer time. or they go and study things that really don't get them a net positive ROI over the years. And so I think it's really important to figure out like what you're studying and how you're thinking about your career as a result of studying that, and whether you're going to just pragmatically be able to afford, whether you have student loans or even without it. Like it's super expensive. Like in Romania, first of all, like the major universities are public. Second of all, you go for free if you take an exam to go into each of the universities. If you're in the first N number, whatever, 100 of people, you get them for free. The next few hundreds you pay. When I talk about paying, it's like, I think $500 to $1,000 a year. That's it. And then afterwards, there's no more space. You go to a private university. If you go to a private university, it probably costs you like $2,000 a year. And it's a worse education, but you basically didn't get into public school. So that's what you get. And so I think it's just very different order of magnitude. I recently moved in the last year to Los Angeles, and we were at the UCLA campus walking with our dog and our baby girl. And as we were walking, I was just like, oh, I wonder nowadays, just like what the cost of education is. Because like when I went to school, it's different. And it's just like, I thought it was insane back in the day. And again, I needed a scholarship to come to the US. My parents were very clear, like, if you want to go to the US, you have to like get a scholarship, because otherwise we cannot afford to send you there. And nowadays, just like, it's even more expensive than before, right? Because it's like price have grown so much to the point that I think when you put it all up, like UCLA, because it's a public school, is actually a little bit more affordable, meaning it probably costs like $50,000 a year. If you go to, like, I looked up Drexel the other day, it's like probably close to $100,000 all in per year. Like you're coming out of a 4-year program with almost $500,000 spent either in debt or that you've spent it at otherwise, like you can spend it on something else. And so that's why you really need to be thoughtful whether you're getting worth the experience, because otherwise that's why you end up in this situation where like you go to school, you don't study something that gets your job, you go into student loans which have their own set of problems, then you pay them for like the next 20 years that prevents you from being financially independent. It's just like, it's really, really a messed up system.
Or as a
and I think
parent,
people should,
Cos,
yeah,
I foot the bill for 2 kids to go to Drexel, which is
Yep.
insane.
I mean, it's yeah, and that's why people, I mean, you save your entire life, right? From the day your kids are born now, you start saving. And even then, when I looked at, because like I said, our baby girl is 6 months now, and so I looked at basically all the programs where you start saving for college.
Yeah, you
When
got to
I looked
get
at it,
a
like,
529 plan.
yeah, but the
Yeah.
limits on 529 are actually not that high. I look at it, I'm like, okay, like the max contribution I can put over time. It's just like, it's not like, if I think about education costs continuing to grow at a similar pace, I was like, they will pay for like a year of school by the time it's older. It's just like, it's really, those things haven't been updated either to kind of keep up with the kind of like the education cost inflation that we've seen. So it's really hard as a parent. And yeah, to your point, if you have multiple kids, like, oof. Yeah, and that's all university. Like I have friends who basically like look at private schools even sooner, and just like the costs are just insane.
I think when you described your kind of journey to the United States and kind of this mission that you had in mind of what you wanted to do and what you wanted to achieve here, it seems on its face very, pragmatic or almost kind of like prototypical, right? Like attend university, get a job, get a green card, stay in the US. That's fine. But I think you're underselling it a little bit, right? Like underneath that kind of immigrant experience, there's this overarching theme of being willing to get out of your comfort zone, right? And I've noticed just from like hearing you talk and kind of like following your bio, your history a little bit, you often credit your success to that willingness to get out of your comfort zone. And it's very difficult for a lot of people. Like, can you share some advice for people that feel like they can't do that or don't yet have that ability?
Yeah, I would say one of the Brex values is growth mindset, and I really strongly believe in that. So I think everybody can actually do that. I don't think it's easy for anyone. Like I don't think it's easy for me. Like I've moved around every few years. I've had to make new friends. It's never easy. Obviously, move countries. None of those things are easy. What I've realized for me, I think there's a common thing that kind of pushes me into that, which is boredom. So if I think about, let's take my career at Microsoft. I was at Microsoft. I had a really good career, really good bosses. I worked on the like highest growing products. Very little complaints from that perspective. Yet at some point, I started feeling bored. I started feeling like I'm not growing as much. I'm not learning. I'm kind of doing the same things over and over again. Everything I was using was .NET, and so I was just programming .NET. And I was like, okay, like I wish I would learn and be able to use other technologies, but like at Microsoft at the time, it was very much like the Microsoft ecosystem. And yes, I can go work at different parts of the company that work on different products, but after some period of time, 6 months or a year, it kind of normalizes because there's like a common culture and a common set of like systems that exist there. And same with Seattle, living there. Like I love Seattle. I have a ton of friends there. I go there multiple times a year still. But after a while, it's just like I've been to all the places, restaurants. Like I'm kind of bored of the city. I want new experiences. And that's what got me to move to San Francisco and try something completely different, going to like from like Microsoft to like a 100% startup that very few people had heard of at the time. And I kind of like went through that again and again and again until I got to a point where it's like, okay, I've kind of like built teams at Stripe. I've managed larger teams. I've managed new teams. I've managed product. I've managed engineer. I've done international stuff. Like, what's next for me? I wasn't necessarily planning on leaving at the time, but like I knew at some point I would. So the main drive for pushing me out of my comfort zone is my inability to deal with boredom. If I'm bored, it is horrible. I cannot just be like the coaster to like, oh, I know people who say like I come to work, but I get my job done in like 3 hours. That drives me nuts. Whenever I'm in that situation, if it lasts more than a few days where I'm like, I don't have stuff to do, like it literally drives me nuts. And so the need to get out of my comfort zone is not predicated on, oh, I want to grow, I want to experience, I want to challenge myself. It's more I feel bored and I want to get out of that. And the way I get out of my state of boredom is to push myself and to get out of my comfort zone and then learn. But it's not easy. Once I do that, it's not easy. Like moving to LA in a world in which like everybody works remotely, we don't have a ton of friends here. It's like, it was not an easy thing socially. Leaving Microsoft, which was a very comfortable environment and a company that everybody knew, and going to like a 100% startup was not easy. Leaving Stripe once it started growing and going to a 50% or 40% company at the time, who again, like no one had heard of, not an easy thing, not an easy thing to do once you're doing that. But the other thing that I learned is once you kind of just like get past it and you kind of like start building momentum, you forget, you kind of get back into, even though you're outside your comfort zone, you get rid of that feeling that of that anxiety of being outside of your comfort zone. And so really there's the pre-change time when I get bored. There's the actual moment of making a change, which is scary still after all these years. And then shortly thereafter, it just becomes the new norm, but you're still kind of learning and pushing yourself and growing, which is kind of the added benefit. And so when I look at it, it's just like, it's pretty easy for choice for me to be able to do that. But it's still, I wouldn't say easy to actually make that change.
So what's next?
I mean, people ask me, because I've been at Brex now for 4 years, and I've gotten that question since people at 4 years tend to leave. One thing that I've really enjoyed about my job and my role, and the fact that Brex has had the trajectory that it's had, is that my job changes roughly every 6 to 12 months. Like if I think about what I had to do year over year at Brex, it's been so different that I haven't gotten that feeling of boredom. Like I don't think there's been a time at Brex where I've had like that period of like several days where I'm like, I have nothing to do, I'm bored out of my mind. It's always almost the opposite. And so I haven't had the need from that perspective. The move to LA was the most recent thing, which was I had been in San Francisco for 7 years, which was the longest I've ever been in a city since moving to the US. My partner had moved from London She was there for like 3 years when we decided to move. And then with both our companies going remote, we were like, okay, where else would we want to live? And similarly, we kind of make lists and try them out and traveled. And that was kind of getting our outside of our comfort zone, since we have a ton of friends there, we knew everything there. So that was probably the most recent thing. And now, like I said, 6 months ago was having a baby, which I think will keep me outside of my comfort zone for the next 18 years or whatever.
Plus, right?
Yeah, plus. So I don't think I'm gonna have. I don't have any itch from any of these angles of like, oh, I'm bored, I have nothing to do. And so tons of changes happening across the board, and even without making changes, like I said, the day to day at Brex, given the trajectory of the company, has changed so much that that I feel that every year I'm still learning a ton.
I think it's really interesting that you mentioned kind of the trajectory of Brex, right? Because it's been almost meteoric in a sense, right? So it's a startup that basically came out of nowhere, obviously, and it's competing with the likes of American Express, which is, one of the most storied companies ever. And so as a result, I mean, perhaps no surprise to you, Brex and fintech startups are some of the most searched and discussed topics on Blind. It seems like quite a few people want to work at Brex. Do you have kind of insider tips or a behind the scenes look into what makes someone stand out as a candidate if they want to work at Brex or work on your team?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly hired our fair share people. I would say the things that make people successful at Brex is kind of threefold. Number one, I think it's a baseline that you're exceptional at your job. So I don't even put that as a separate criteria, because I think in order to get a job at any strong company, you kind of have to be great at your whatever you're doing, whether it's software engineering, marketing, sales, whatever it is. Like, you need to be great at that for your own trade. Number two, we have a set of company values, and so Pedro and Enrique actually had them before I even joined Brex. So pretty early on, they thought about the culture they want to have at the company, and we've iterated to them. We've added a couple, we've removed a couple, we've renamed a couple to kind of like keep up with the company and what it's most valuable. And in my second year, I think we added basically a values interview where we basically go through those and evaluate candidates against our values. And there's three ways. You can either be a promoter, you can display a value, or you can be a detractor. And we incorporate that throughout not just the interviewing process, but also performance reviews to make sure, and promotions to make sure that we don't have people who detract from our values, and that in leadership positions, especially, we have people who are promoters, so that it kind of continues growing. And then the third one, which is probably more on the individual side, is I think people at Brex who do well have an innate nature of curiosity and kind of personal drive. Like, we're not a company that micromanages people. We're not a company that basically like pushes you or like has to like nag you to do work. It's kind of expected that you're self-sufficient and you kind of have that personal drive. And so that's both stands out in the interview process, but also afterwards. If I think about the people who have had the best careers or the fastest trajectories, there's these people who like constantly want to learn and grow, and to your earlier point, get out of their comfort zones, while being really aligned with our values. So I think if you have those kind of characteristics, you end up doing really, really well at Brex. I think in terms of like people applying to Brex, for the most part, it's just like, yeah, be a nice person who's like self-driven and has a curious nature. And in general, like, again, if you're proud of your craft, whatever that craft is, you end up standing out in the process.
I think it's really great that you say that, because I think right now there's this kind of growing trend of kind of trying to quote unquote game these like interviews, right? Where if I go and study like my computer science textbook, or I really understand these like algorithms and data structures, it almost becomes like kind of like rote memorization, right? Where there are even problem sets out there for
Totally.
specific companies or industries. But I love your approach that it's really holistic, and sure, you might be attracted by a company's brand name or their culture, but you really have to kind of take that extra step to say, hey, like I'm interviewing you just as much as you're interviewing me, right?
100%. I spend for the first years I would interview everybody in engineering. Over time, obviously that doesn't scale, and so
Right.
I try to focus on where I can provide most value. But I still like whenever I meet candidates, everybody leaves time for questions at the end, and we're very transparent. Like you should like ask whatever you want. And as part of our closing process, we also had this philosophy that we would talk to people. There's most candidates, especially over the last years, they have multiple job offers. And there's always an expectation. It's like, oh, you want them to love the company and mission, but like at the end of the day, they do that as they grow with the company. It's not like it was someone's dream growing up to grow at Brex because Brex didn't exist. And the reality is
Right.
there's like Brex is a great company, but there's other great companies. And so most people that interview with Brex tend to have offers from a bunch of like top tier companies. And so I always tell them like the way you should approach it, and that's part of our closing process, like leaving comp aside, because I think there's systems for that. And let's assume that we make that work. Is Brex your top choice? If Brex is your top choice, great. Then comp is the only thing that we need to sort out. And then if both sides really want to make something work, they will. And then we have ladders and levels and systems. And so in general, it's pre-formulated at this point. If Brex isn't your top choice, either another company is your top choice based on your experience, in which case, great, you should just go there. Like take that and don't hedge Brex because you want to get a better comp offer or anything like that. Like it's not even worth it. Or you might not know, you might have some doubts, you might have some questions, in which case, great, make sure you answer those. So I typically ask them, is Brex your top choice? And if not, why not? Like, tell me what's holding you back. And I've had some people when we're in the office, they would be like, well, I don't want to do the commute. I was like, totally get it. Then don't do the commute. Like that's not going to change. I can't say anything about it. Or they want to be in a specific field. Like, oh, I want to work on crypto. Quick, go work at a crypto company. I want to work in AI. Go quick, work at an AI company. Like, if there's things that you want that are very clear and you have a path for that, and it's not aligned with Brex, then you should go and do what's great for you, and no hard feelings whatsoever. It's a process. If there's things where like I'm not sure which team I would work on, great, we can work through those and bring clarity to make sure you have all the data points to decide, because it is a big decision. Like even though I don't know what the average tenure is nowadays, like 2-3 years. Like we've had people at Brex that were like, I was looking at the beginning of the year, how many people are going to hit 4 years this year? It's like quite a lot at Brex. Like we have people who stay for a long time, and so it's a big deal, especially when you think about like your career, and especially if you think about like some of the most productive years of your career. Like it's really important to make the right choice for you. And so I want people to do the right thing. Similar when people leave, like I have people like the number one attrition reason I think we've had in the company, at least within engineering, has been people founding their own companies. Like there's a ton of companies who have been founded from Brex people. And when someone comes, it's like, oh, I want to be a founder, I want to found my own company, I generally talk to them. It's like, great, do you have an idea? Do you have the founders? Have you thought through it? I can't sell you on something when it's something very different. Like if you want to be a founder, you should be a founder. It's a very different experience. There's nothing like, I never believe these companies that are like, oh, I can create, like you can be a startup within a startup. It's not a thing. We used to try that at Stripe, and it was really like, it would delay the inevitable, where like you keep someone for like 6 more months and then they leave, because like you're not a startup if you have the brand and the recruiting team and the engineering machinery and the systems. Like you're not fundraising, you're not struggling, you don't have that struggle. And so like that's part of being a founder. It's the most interesting and unique part. And so just go do that. But in general, like when people evaluate Brex both on the way in and potentially leaving, like I'm always like, you should optimize for yourself. Like I very much believe, like now as I see the round of layoffs that are happening, like it's really sad, because like I'd say Microsoft, Google, they've done layoffs recently, and you see these people, I've been at the company for 20 years, 30 years with my family, and it's like, at the end of the day, it actually isn't. Like, you should do what's best for you. If you're happy about the 20 years that you've had at Google and you made the most of it, and this is great, you've actually spent all or majority of your career in a place, and you're happy with it. If you hated it, but you just stay there because it was comfortable or whatever, and now you regret it because it kind of changes that for you, that's really on you. Like, I really want people to kind of own their career, even as a management. Like, we tell people in one-on-ones and performance and careers, like, my job as a manager and as a leader is to help helping your company. You need to define what you want. Like, if someone doesn't know what they want, I really work with them to figure out what they want, not me telling you what you should want. Like, there's plenty of role models. What I've done is very different than what other people do. I didn't want to be a manager. When I was at Microsoft, I hated the idea of management. I was like, I think they're like just process and bureaucrats, and they do anything. I want to do technical things. I was even a manager for a little bit at Microsoft, and I hated it. And then when I joined Stripe, they wanted me to be a manager, and I was like, nope, zero interest. But then I realized that in a small company is very different. Like, what I experienced at Microsoft as a manager and what I saw other people at Stripe was very different. And that's kind of how I got into it. But it wasn't like, I was always attracted by the technical aspects and solving problems and systems, not the bureaucracy of it. And so you never, like, things can change over time. That's the other thing. Like, people think they have this like dream that they have to pursue over the like years and decades. Like, it's not. Figure out for the next couple of years what you want to do, make a plan for that, and do it. I try not to plan for more than a year. I think it's really hard in this day and age to plan for more than a year. If you just look at the past years, like, would I have thought when I joined Microsoft that I'm going to leave? No, I was thinking about what it is to be like at a certain level and certain team and certain roles, or like senior architects, whatever. When I was at Stripe, would I have thought about like going to management? No. Would I have thought about leaving Stripe and going to a small startup? No. Like, you never, like, 1 year is roughly 1 to 2 years, I think, is a time frame that you can kind of plan ahead before things change so much. Like, not to mention the last few years, obviously, remote office, all that stuff in the culture.
Got it. I really appreciate that advice. Do you have any kind of last bit of advice that you kind of see maybe like young technologists kind of making over and over again that you kind of want to have an opportunity to maybe course correct for them?
I think one of the things that I would encourage them, number one, is this idea that like, you should kind of be the master of your own life, because that's the only one who's going to do it. Again, everybody else can help you. Like, I think if you're in an environment that's toxic, you should leave, cut your losses quickly. I don't believe in sunk cost fallacy. And I think that's one of the mistakes people do. They'll join something and they like hate it and they stay through that. And it's just like, life's too short, just like make the most of it.
Right.
I think people, if you're surrounded by people professionally or personally who are detractors in your life or like hurting, cut them. If you're surrounded by people who are helping you, their job is to help you, but not to decide for you. And I think that's probably one of the things that I would give most advice is just like, I was fortunate that I had good managers at Microsoft early on. They still kind of pushed me in one direction or the other, and I had to think for myself if I want that direction or not. But at least they were there to help me, and I kind of understood that. And so find those people, but at the end of the day, it's your responsibility. If someone wants to do something, they should like figure out how to make it happen and get the people to help them. And the other one is just like, it's fine to change your mind. Like, I find that people have a conception of what they want, and then they believe that changing that makes them less true to themselves or whatever. It's not true. Like, you evolve as a human being, you want different things. And so it's totally fine to kind of live it. There's no shame or no anything. Now, if you change too often, I think that's the other mistake. I think it's bad. Like, I see people that, like, speaking of candidates, so you review, and every year they've been at a different company. And that's just not great. Not because there's this like sense of loyalty or anything like that. I don't believe in that. It's mostly because I feel that you just don't have enough time to grow within that space. Like, the first few months in a company, you're just getting used to how the company works. You're just learning the technical stack as a software engineer. You're just learning how to operate with people. Then you're building stuff. But then it needs time to mature. And the hard part is not necessarily building something, but it's evolving that. Building like 0 to 1 software is actually much easier than iterating through software that's already in production and kind of evolving it over time. And I think if you're in short time spans, you just don't get that experience. And so that's what questions is just like how that career grows. And the last one, which I've had to give some advice, as I've seen both people at Stripe and Brex leave early on, is things compound over time, and make sure you have those things going for you. Like I had friends at Stripe who basically like left super early, and then like financially didn't compound for them, experience-wise didn't compound for them. They ended up going to, there's people who joined when Stripe was like 100, 200 people are like, oh, I joined too late, I'm going to join a 10% company. And they joined and the company went nowhere. And they joined another company and they went nowhere. And then another company and went nowhere. And if they would have stayed at Stripe or at Brex during that time, they would have learned so much more. Everything would have compounded so much more for them. And I think especially in the first, let's say, 10 to 20 years of your career, right? So from like your 20s to your 40s, like having that compounding nature, I think is really critical and really important and underestimated, because the nature of compounding is you don't notice it until later on. But by the time you notice it, it's too late. That's the same thing with like how people talk about investments and 401k and retirement, all that stuff is like invest early. But the same thing is true for your career. So make sure that things compound over time and you're not just like hopping and bouncing around between random companies, random industries, and that thing, there's no like compounding story to
it. I love that insight. I think especially for the blind community, they're so ambitious. It's why we named the podcast The Blind Ambition. They want to level up. They almost act like mercenaries, which could be fine for a certain lifestyle, but that power of compounding, it's what is it? It's called the eighth wonder of finance or something like that. The eighth wonder of the world. Also true for your profession, your career. So thanks for that reminder, Cosmin.
Of course.